The PS2 era truly was a wonderful time for video games. It gave us many gems that are now considered classics of their respective genres. But there were just as many that were overlooked and would only gain recognition among cult circles. One such gem is Shadow Hearts, a franchise that lived and died on the PS2. It's fairly difficult to play these days without the use of an emulator or paying outrageous prices from eBay resellers, but I still thought it deserved an overview. Shadow Hearts is, quite simply, a product of a bygone era that should be celebrated. It was back when JRPGs were a lot more experimental and daring. Instead of a traditional fantasy setting, Shadow Hearts found the fantasy in our own world. Much like another franchise I'm partial to talking about on this channel. It's an adventure across the world with elements of gothic and Lovecraftian horror, set against the backdrop of major historical events, usually with some anachronisms along the way.
Yeah, I could use some help here.
The tone tends to differ with each entry, but there are some overarching themes tying them all together. A book called The Emigre Manuscript is always the crux of the story in some way or another. It's an ancient tome containing the forbidden, arcane knowledge of resurrecting the dead. Each game shows the folly of man in trying to make use of this black magic and how it ultimately always ends in suffering and strife. Another series tradition is a party member of the vampiric Valentine family, each of which always has a small cameo in the previous game before they appear proper. There's a lot of other recurring motifs, but for now, let's go over each game one by one. This first entry doesn't bear the Shadow Hearts title, but it can retroactively be considered its predecessor, and would lay the groundwork for everything that would follow. Koudelka was the first console game by Saknov, a developer founded by ex-Squaresoft composer Hiroki Kikuta, who would also serve as its director, producer, writer, and, of course, composer. It takes place in 1898 and follows a gypsy medium named Koudelka Isant, who is mysteriously drawn to a haunted monastery in Wales. Once there, she just narrowly manages to save an adventurer by the name of Edward Plunkett, and a bishop called James O'Flaherty. Together they must brave the terrifying demons and apparitions that roam its gothic halls, and discover the truth behind its grisly past. Visually, it resembles games of the survival horror genre at the time, particularly in its use of 3D models on top of pre-rendered backgrounds. The use of a single, closed-off location with esoteric puzzles also brings to mind the original Resident Evil. However, in terms of core gameplay, they couldn't be any more different. Koudelka features random encounters and turn-based battles like its JRPG contemporaries, making it a unique and strange mix of genres. The battle system has something of a chessboard motif with its 3 playable party members. Both they and the enemy are bound to a grid and cannot move past each other without incapacitating them first. This splits your party members into 2 types of characters. The melee attackers, who hold the front line.
Go on, punch him, Edward. Oof!
And the magic users, who stay in the back and focus on healing, buffs, and magic attacks. Characters can be knocked back a space by attacks, creating an interesting dynamic where enemies can slowly creep closer to your vulnerable glass cannons in the back. You can build the characters however you wish, but typically Koudelka is your best magic user, Edward is your tank, and James can be either. But the true appeal of Koudelka lies not in its gameplay, but its story. Kikuta's intention with this game was to create something truly distinct from anything else that had been done in the genre at the time. He wanted a more mature story than those often penned at Squaresoft.
Still, Did try to kill us. For that. What did you do that for?
The characters in Koudelka are not your typical JRPG protagonists. They're deeply flawed and, in many ways, very broken people who do not get along at all, and this is portrayed to great effect by its stellar cast. It might seem rather rudimentary today, but back then, the idea of having motion capture for up to 4 characters at once, and recording their dialogue on set, was new and experimental. Even though the game is Japanese, these scenes were recorded in California with English-speaking actors, allowing it to escape the trend of incredibly stilted voice acting that was pervasive in games at the time. Again, using the first Resident Evil as a prime offender.
Hope this is not Chris's blood.
The dialogue in this game is excellently written and the acting is fantastic.
Life's a gamble, and once you place your bet, you'd better play to win, or else you end up dead.
Edward, you really are ridiculous.
That's what they tell me.
Even with the low poly models, the actors are able to convey a lot of nuance with their movements and vocal performances. Koudelka herself is gloomy, pessimistic, and not always the nicest person to be around, but she always sticks up for the weak and unloved. She's made it her mission to stop others from experiencing the same hardships she did. On the other hand, we have Edward, who can best be described as a lovable rogue. Throughout the story, these two act as a foil to James, whose devout faith blinds him to the true horrors happening in the monastery.
How could such a kind and faithful couple be cold-blooded killers? This is the work of jealousy and greed.
They challenge him to look at the world from a different perspective, making for a lot of engaging, snappy scenes where they bicker back and forth. The characters themselves are unconventional, but this idea of different people coming together to accomplish a common goal is classic RPG storytelling. There are various other characters that are encountered, but perhaps the most important one for the series as a whole is Roger Bacon.
Where are my manners? Hello! My name is Roger Bacon. I am a monk from the Franciscan order.
A monk?
He's a warlock who has lived for hundreds of years and is responsible for transcribing the Emigre manuscript. He appears in every game in the series with varying importance, but always as an ally who gives assistance to the party. He can be seen as the comic relief mascot character that ties everything together. He's based on the real Roger Bacon, an English scientist and philosopher from the 13th century who dabbled in magic and alchemy. This fictionalized version of him gained immortality through the secret rituals found within the Emigre manuscript. Although he's not ageless, as his mummified appearance and mad ramblings can attest.
Oh, Heavenly Father, bless our souls and bring forth an end to this suffering.
Koudelka is a unique game that has many qualities that aren't even shared by the other Shadow Hearts games, but its battle system was considered slow even for its time. This was the only part of the game that Hiroki Kikuta had no direct involvement with. According to Kikuta, the other staff felt the game was becoming too unconventional for its own good. It's unclear what kind of battle system Kikuta himself would have implemented, but I think we can all agree that it certainly would have been different. After the release of this game, Kikuta would depart Saknov and leave the future of the series in the hands of other developers. Which brings us to the next game in this overview. The first Shadow Hearts was released a couple years later for the PlayStation 2. It follows on from the bad ending of Koudelka and begins in the year 1913. A girl who is being escorted on a train is suddenly kidnapped by a powerful warlock, who goes by a familiar name, Roger Bacon. However, she's able to escape with the help of a cocky and rude young hero by the name of Yuri Hyuga. He's a harmonixer, a human with the rare ability of being able to fuse with demons and use their powers as if they were his own. Yuri's heroic introduction is undercut by some rather ominous comments he makes towards his damsel in distress. This is our first big hint that he's not our typical JRPG protagonist. He's actually being compelled to carry out his mission by a mysterious voice that's been relaying him information. He must keep the girl, named Alice Elliot, safe from those trying to use her strong magical abilities for their own evil ends. This is an adventure that takes them from China to various locations across Europe. Along the way, they meet other strange characters who lend their assistance. This game is actually a lot closer to a standard JRPG adventure, with the freedom to choose who you want in your party at any given time. At least for the most part. Yuri is locked in since he's the protagonist. Like Koudelka, you're only able to bring 3 party members into battle. But there's an interesting new gameplay mechanic introduced here. One that would go on to define the series and lend it that recognizable touch. For characters to perform any action, they must first succeed at the Judgment Ring, a sort of minigame with a hand sweeping clockwise around this ring. The player must press the X button when it's over the coloured areas, or else no action is taken and they miss their turn. For simple actions like using an item, this is a fairly simple and easy process. But for attacks and magic, it gets a little more complicated. The number of areas to hit increases and their size decreases. With regular attacks, each successful hit equals 1 attack in their combo. Even with a miss, it isn't a wasted turn as long as you manage to hit the first area in the sequence at the very least. With some magic skills, they'll instead be green areas, and all of these need to be hit for the skill to be performed. You might also notice these sections of red at the end of some of the hit areas. Hitting these allows for critical damage. So what we have here is a system that rewards not necessarily quick reflexes, but timing in rhythm. It's a very intuitive mechanic that is easy to understand while also being fairly difficult to master. This is far from the only thing that separates it from Koudelka's battle system though. Another new mechanic is the rather Lovecraftian concept of sanity points, which are consumed at the beginning of each character's turn. Once their sanity reaches 0, they'll go berserk, and you'll no longer be able to give them commands. To prevent this, you must keep an eye on their sanity and use items to replenish it. Yuri has the most sanity points of them all, but this is because he has to use them to fuse with demons. Higher level demons requires more sanity points to use. Before Yuri can use them though, he must first defeat them in the graveyard, which is a visual representation of his own psyche. The more creatures Yuri's defeated, the stronger their desire for vengeance grows, and this attaches to his soul and brings him closer to death. This is known as malice. Its intensity is represented by the 4 colours in Yuri's talisman: blue, green, yellow, and finally, red. Once it reaches red, the gates of death are opened in the graveyard, and a being known as Foxface is free to terrorize Yuri during random encounters. Like the graveyard itself, Foxface is a Jungian entity tied to Yuri's subconscious, and is extremely difficult to defeat. He outright tells you to just run away. Only when the malice has been purified from Yuri's talisman will Foxface stop haunting him. But this is only a temporary solution. Like Koudelka, Yuri Hyuga was designed to be a different kind of JRPG protagonist, one that was a bit rougher around the edges. He's characterized as a somewhat dim yet kind-hearted bruiser who is driven by instinct rather than logic. He has a childlike purity that is heavily contrasted by his aloof appearance, especially in his demon form. He also serves as the protagonist of this next game in the series. Shadow Hearts 2, or Shadow Hearts Covenant in the West, is a direct sequel to the first game and takes place 6 months later at the beginning of World War I. Once again, it follows on from the bad ending of the previous game, but in this case it's much more central to the plot. Because of this, it's a difficult story to surmise without spoiling the first game a little. The story begins at a small village in France after Yuri had lost someone very dear to him. He's been defending its residents from the advancing German armies using his Harmonixer powers. However, a secret organization known as Sapientes Gladio plots his demise with the use of the Holy Mistletoe, an ancient relic for exorcising demons. Initially, they're assisted by German Army Lieutenant Karin Koenig, but she quickly defects when it becomes clear that their ideals are less than noble. The organization is actually led from the shadows by Grigory Rasputin in a bid to conquer all of Europe. Getting rid of Yuri was just preemptive self-defense. Because he was stabbed by the Holy Mistletoe, Yuri loses all of his demons and has to regain them one by one via the graveyard. Yes, this is an in-universe excuse for why Yuri has to start from zero after the first game, but it also raises the stakes in a surprisingly dark twist. The Holy Mistletoe is slowly eating away at his soul and will eventually leave him as a husk. Because of this, Covenant has a very depressing tone at times, especially during its second half. This is offset by the inclusion of more comical and light-hearted moments though.
That is one giant pussy.
Covenant takes some of the sillier elements from the previous game and ups the ante, while also dialing back the horror aesthetics that were inherited from Koudelka. According to the director, this was done to address the criticisms that the first game was too dark and unconventional. Matsuzo Machida was the director of both SH1 and 2, and it's easy to see how his vision for the series differed from Kikuta's. Kikuta was an advocate for dark and mature storytelling outside of conventional JRPG norms. This is also true of Machida to some extent, but he drew influence from more familiar sources, such as Go Nagai. Because of this, SH1 and 2 don't stray too far from what you'd expect from a JRPG, especially when you take into consideration that Covenant quite literally takes us back to Japan. Make no mistake though, they're still definitely unconventional. SH2 is both silly and serious, but it never feels tonally inconsistent. It brings closure to Yuri's story in a poignant way that gives a new perspective on the first game. It does what a good sequel should do. It uses the foundations to build new and interesting stories within its world. And like a good video game sequel, it improves upon the gameplay as well. This time you can take 4 party members into battle and customize their magic skills using crests. The Judgment Ring returns and is also highly customizable. You can change the number of attacks, expand the hit and strike areas, and even the type of ring you want to use. There's also a new combo system for increased damage. This can be done by moving a party member next to another and having them attack immediately after their turn. If you're able to string your entire party into a combo, there'll be extra powerful magic available on the last turn. The reward is great, but so is the risk. Moving your characters next to each other like this puts them in range of area of effect magic. The same rules apply to the enemy though, so magic is a lot more important here than it was in the original game. A director's cut of SH2 was released a year later, but only in Japan. It features some extra dungeons, cutscenes, and various other small additions. It also features a trailer for the final game we're going to be looking at in this overview. Shadow Hearts from the New World is the final game in the series and is technically not considered Shadow Hearts free. With that being said, it's still a direct sequel to Covenant and makes several small references to it. This time we're jumping ahead over a decade to the year 1929. As its title suggests, the setting is the last place the series had yet to explore: the Americas. This time we're not playing as Yuri, but a new protagonist.
Welcome to Garland's Detective Agency. I'm the boss, Johnny Garland.
One day, Johnny is given his first big case by a suspicious-looking gentleman who is definitely not the villain. He's been tasked with finding someone who had skipped out on bail. But, as you might have guessed, it doesn't go at all as planned. Johnny is attacked by a monster and is just narrowly saved by a woman named Shania, who can transform into monsters in a similar fashion to Yuri. Although she's not a harmonixer. She's merely making a soul pact with the spirits of the land. Nevertheless, the two are mechanically identical. Shania is on a quest of vengeance to kill the one who destroyed her village and wiped out her tribe. Johnny decides to join her in hopes it'll help him uncover the truth behind his own past, and his strange magical abilities. As per series tradition, a team of diverse misfits are assembled along the way. All of them are working towards the common goal of stopping a mysterious mute woman named simply Lady, who is on a single-minded mission to open a portal of malice and unleash its contents on the world. She's assisted by another character with a simple descriptor rather than a name: Killer, a serial killer who was saved by Lady and shows his gratitude by becoming her loyal accomplice. This one is not as well liked for its story since it doubles down on the silliness introduced in the previous game.
What are you gawking at? What's so unusual about a talking cat these days, anyway?
The gothic atmosphere and horror are almost entirely absent, save for the monster designs. These hideous creatures are the last holdout of that Koudelka DNA. From the New World is a crazy adventure that really wants to get a lot of use out of its time period and setting. For example, the early game has your party breaking into Alcatraz to rescue Al Capone, who is a surprisingly nice guy. The traditional vampire party member seems to think she's a magical girl, and can transition between curvy and slim depending on how much blood she's drank from the enemies. It's undoubtedly a very weird game.
Lauded UFO legend lands in Roswell. Giant cat commands crime crown in Chicago Mafia.
Some of it works, some of it really doesn't. The ambiguous relationship between its antagonists Lady and Killer is very interesting, but the relationships between our own party members feels incredibly underdeveloped at times. Where this game truly shines though is in its gameplay, which is a much more refined version of Covenant's battle system. The combos return, but now they can be done without bunching all your party members together, provided they have a full bar of stock. Stock is a new mechanic, and it's gained whenever a character deals or receives damage. A full bar of stock can be used to give a character 2 actions in one turn, and using both bars will allow a combo and a double action in a single turn. You can use this to pull off some incredibly long combos if you don't mess up somewhere in the chain. How you decide to build your party members plays into this as well. Instead of crests like in Covenant, we now have the stellar charts, which are similar but allows for a bit more customization. It's a good idea to get a nice balance of magic skills when playing around with everyone's stellar charts. Some magic only works when the enemy is on the ground or in the air, for example, and all magic bounces them in different directions. so you'll need to keep in mind where the enemy is going to be on the next turn of your combo. This encourages you to have a nice balance of ground, air and mid-range magic for all eventualities. While the combo system in Covenant could be safely ignored altogether, the one here is essential to victory. It's a satisfying battle system and easily the best the series has to offer. Sadly, as previously mentioned, it would also be the last. This is where the Shadow Hearts series came to an end. Saknov, or Nautilus as it would later rename itself, would close its doors and never again make another game. The characters from Covenant would later appear in the crossover game Chaos Wars, which is infamous for having one of the worst English dubs ever.
Wow, I really can't move my body.
What did you do, Nicole?
Chances are you've heard this voice acting before, and it was your only exposure to Shadow Hearts until this video. So, allow me to clarify. Yuri sounds way better in the games.
Listen to me, shithead. I'm coming for you now.
Stop it. Come on and get me. Or are you too scared?
Other media I've neglected to mention is the Koudelka manga that acts as a sequel to the original game. It takes place a year later and follows Koudelka after she escapes from a sanatorium and is inflicted with amnesia. Even though it's completely ignored by the backstory of Shadow Hearts, it is the only other piece of media that stars Koudelka for better or worse. Finally, it's worth mentioning Machida's original concept for Shadow Hearts 3, which was revealed during an interview but will likely never be made. It would have been a prequel that followed Yuri's father, Ben Hyuga, and the father of Kurando from the second game. There's even a couple illustrations by Miyako Kato depicting them. It's difficult to look at these and not think about what could have been. With this in mind though, it's important to appreciate the games we did get. All four of them are special in their own right and bring something new to the table. It was an interesting series that I urge you all to try sometime, if only one of them. They don't make them like this anymore.